Early this week, fighting broke out between Druze and Bedouin militias in the Syrian governorate of al-Sharaa. However, when Syria's government forces tried to intervene, Israel reacted by launching airstrikes at targets not just in al-Sharaa, but also in and around the capital of Damascus, including both Syria's presidential palace and the defense ministry. A ceasefire has since been agreed, but previous ceasefires haven't held, and even if this one does, Syria's new president al-Sharaa made it clear on Thursday that this week's events marked a turning point in his government's relationship with Israel. So in this video, we're going to explain why fighting broke out, why Israel intervened, and what might happen next. Could you rank every single politician in the world? Hear our thoughts and argue with us on our podcast, the World Leader Leaderboard. Find it on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So, to understand this story, you need to know a bit of context about Syria's demographics. By far the largest single ethnic group in Syria are the Sunni Muslim Arab, who, according to the CIA's latest estimates, account for 50% of the population. The remaining 50% or so comprises of Syria's various minorities, who tend to cluster in certain areas. The Alawites, for instance, the ethno-religious group that the Assads came from, who account for about 15% of the population, are concentrated mostly in the coastal areas around the port cities of Tartus and Latakia. The Kurds, who account for about 10% of the population and used to have their own independent state called Rojava to the east of the Euphrates, are mostly concentrated in the north, while the Druze, who account for about 3% of the population, are mostly concentrated in the south. The Druze are a religious minority with a total population of between 1 and 2 million, primarily located in Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, with smaller communities in Jordan. During the Syrian civil war, the Druze formed several militias to defend themselves against the Assad regime, and these Druze militias effectively controlled the southern province of Suwaida, which is the Druze heartland in Syria. When Assad was ousted, there was widespread anxiety that Syria's new president al-Sharaa and his Sunni Arab rebel coalition would be bad news for Syria's minorities. After all, both al-Sharaa and many of the rebel groups that supported him have links to jihadist terror groups, who obviously don't have a great record when it comes to minority rights. Protecting the Druze, for instance, was one of the ways that Israel justified its aggressive interventions in Syria after Assad's ousting, which included hundreds of airstrikes on Syria's military installations, with the threat of further strikes if the Druze rights weren't protected, the occupation of what had previously been a UN buffer zone between the already occupied Golan Heights and southern Syria, and a demand from Netanyahu that Syria's 3 southern governorates be, quote, demilitarized, i.e. that none of Shara's government forces be deployed there, and they instead be governed by local police forces. Nonetheless, contrary to what you might expect, al-Sharaa basically accepted all of Israel's demands, and actually pledged to stop terror groups like Hezbollah from acting in southern Syria, as well as promising to protect the rights of Syria's religious and ethnic minorities more generally. And, well, he's been pretty successful on this front. Well, there have been episodes of sectarian violence, most notably in March, when fighting between government forces and the remnants of Assad's security forces triggered days of sectarian violence that killed more than 1,500 people, mostly Alawites. Syria has been far more stable than most people expected, and in March, al-Sharaa successfully negotiated a deal to absorb the Kurdish state of Rojava into Syria's national institutions. However, on Sunday, fighting broke out between Druze and Bedouin groups in Suwaida. For context, the Bedouin are a nomadic Arab tribespeople who are spread throughout Syria, with a sizable presence in the al-Muqaz neighbourhood of Suwaida city. The Druze and Bedouin in Suwaida have never got on brilliantly, and this latest spat apparently started on July 11th, when a Druze vegetable merchant was assaulted by members of Bedouin tribes after they set up an improvised roadblock. This initiated a cycle of retaliatory kidnappings between the two groups, which escalated into an armed conflict on July 13th, after Druze militias surrounded the al-Muqaz neighbourhood and demanded the release of some kidnapped Druze. Fighting continued into Monday, at which point Syria's Interior Ministry announced that its forces would, in coordination with the Defense Ministry, begin direct intervention in the area to end the conflict and impose order, noting, quote, the local community's inability to contain the crisis. However, as Syrian government forces began moving towards Suwaida, they were hit by Israeli airstrikes. Israel carried out further strikes against Syrian government forces in the area on Tuesday, before striking the Syrian Defense Ministry and the presidential palace in Damascus. Again, Israel justified these interventions on the grounds that they needed to protect the Druze. Now, to be fair, some rogue elements of Syria's government forces do seem to have teamed up with the Bedouin against the Druze, and there have been credible reports of human rights violations. Nonetheless, it's hard to believe that Israel's actions are exclusively motivated by concerns for the Druze, given that Netanyahu didn't seem too bothered about minority abuses when Assad was in charge. Anyway, throughout the past week, a pattern has emerged. The Syrian government and Druze leaders would agree to a ceasefire, which usually included some commitment to integrate Suwaida into Syria's national institutions. But every time, some individual Druze leader, usually this guy, would then decide to back out. His followers would resume fighting, thus restarting the wider conflict and inviting further Israeli airstrikes. Anyway, a new ceasefire was agreed on Wednesday evening, although this one looks more likely to hold, because it's been overseen by the US and Turkey. Nonetheless, even if the ceasefire does hold, this still presents al-Sharaa with a difficult problem. So far, al-Sharaa's Israel policy has been one of appeasement. His government has done basically everything that Netanyahu's demanded. But this doesn't seem to have worked. Israel is clearly still suspicious of al-Sharaa's government, and willing to intervene militarily in Syria whenever the IDF feels like it. Al-Sharaa will probably conclude from this episode that to guarantee a stable relationship with Israel, he needs some sticks as well as carrots. And in reality, the only way to achieve this is via deeper military cooperation with Turkey, which has long been al-Sharaa's main backer. And Turkey is probably the only country in the region with sufficient firepower to act as a counterbalance to Israel, and Turkish President Erdogan has been perhaps Netanyahu's most vocal critic since Israel's assault on Gaza began in late 2023. Erdogan probably won't do anything too dramatic in the short term, given Israel's apparent willingness to escalate against anyone who challenges it militarily. But if al-Sharaa decides that it needs to take a more muscular attitude towards Israel, and his speech on Thursday suggests he has, then Syria risks becoming an arena for Israel and Turkey's escalating regional rivalry. More broadly though, it really does feel like we're in a period of political change at the moment. Gone are the days of predictable geopolitics, with Trump's America taking increasingly dramatic turns, so much so that it feels that America's influence, popularity, and dominance are all on the decline. So in the next issue of our magazine, Too Long, we're discussing this shift, and the potential that we're currently observing the end of the American order. In that section of the magazine, we discuss our thoughts on everything from the collapse of democratic norms to if America is losing allies, and if the country can maintain its dominance in energy and tech, before discussing who could potentially take over in a post-American world. So if you want to find out what we really think about America, now's your chance. It's not just the US either though. This issue is our longest ever at 78 pages. So we also get into stories like why El Salvador and Kosovo are becoming the world's penal colonies, if the UK is lacking vision at the moment, if Europe can really defend itself, and why leaders like Putin and Netanyahu seem to be getting away with it. Plus, we also have a full interview with Professor James Kerr-Lindsay, who you might also know from YouTube, all about the collapse of the global order. Now, if that all sounds good to you, but you'd rather listen than read along, then you should check out the premium edition. Because anyone who buys a premium edition of our magazine also gets access to our recordings of selected articles. Plus, you also get access to the full 90-minute interview with James Kerr-Lindsay. On top of that, premium subscribers also get access to our behind-the-scenes podcast, The Bullpen. Regardless of whether you opt for the regular or premium edition, if you never want to miss an issue, then make sure you subscribe to Too Long, which gets you 20% off every copy as long as you stay subscribed. Plus, this week only, if you use the code BESTOFFER when signing up for a subscription, you'll get an additional 35% off. That brings down the cost as low as £5.20, or a wild 48% off. That is the best offer we are ever going to offer. So pre-order your copy today to get yourself that extra content and support all of the journalism we do here at TLDR every single day.